A class trip to the zoo turned into every parent's nightmare. The kids were last seen near the petting area, then vanished. No cries for help, no witnesses, just a sudden closure for maintenance. What investigators uncovered beneath the zoo grounds shocked the entire town. And it wasn't just about the missing children. The morning was full of chatter and anticipation. A yellow school bus bounced along the back roads of Willow Creek, its windows fogged slightly by the breath of 29 excited third graders. Miss Hamilton, a teacher with a calm voice and warm presence, stood near the front, holding a clipboard and checking names as she called attendance one final time. It was the annual spring field trip, and this year's destination was the Timber Valley Zoo, a locally run, family-style zoo with a good reputation and a small petting zoo section popular with kids. It wasn't a large facility, but the zoo prided itself on its hands-on experiences. Parents had signed permission slips weeks ago, and the kids had spent days preparing, reading about goats, alpacas, and tortoises in class. It was supposed to be the perfect trip. The zoo itself was nestled in a wooded clearing outside town, bordered by thin trees and silent dirt paths. It had a slightly outdated charm, wooden signs, faded paint on the fences, and the distinct smell of hay, fur, and damp grass. They arrived around 10:15 a.m., and by 10:30, the group had split into smaller clusters, each led by either a parent or Ms. Hamilton herself. They wandered through the bird enclosures, watched a feeding demonstration with the sea lions, and even got to pet a tortoise named Myrtle. The kids were energized but well-behaved, happily snapping photos with disposable cameras. By noon, the group reconvened at the picnic tables near the petting zoo. The area itself was fenced in, with a narrow gate leading into a circular path lined with goats, rabbits, chickens, and a few sheep. One section, however, was clearly marked with an orange plastic ribbon and a laminated sign, "Closed for maintenance. Do not enter." The enclosure behind it looked empty except for a small tool shed and a few low pens. The kids didn't think much of it. Miss Hamilton gave them 15 minutes to explore the open areas while she and the parents kept watch from nearby. Laughter echoed as kids tried feeding goats and chased chickens gently around the pen. Several parents took photos, and one child managed to spill an entire bag of feed across the walkway. When the 15 minutes were up, Miss Hamilton blew her whistle twice, their usual signal to regroup. Children came running back, some sticky from juice boxes, others giggling with hay clinging to their clothes. She counted heads. 25. She frowned, counted again. Still 25. "Where are Dylan, Max, Zoe, and Izzy?" she asked, scanning the small crowd. No one had seen them go. The parents exchanged glances. "They were just with us, near the rabbits," one said. "I think I saw Dylan by the goats a minute ago." The group fanned out across the petting zoo, calling names, checking behind fences and inside the tool shed. The missing area behind the orange tape drew nervous glances, but it looked undisturbed. Miss Hamilton finally walked over to the nearest zoo staff member, a young man in a faded uniform polo, and asked if he had seen the children. "No," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "But they couldn't have gotten far. Probably just wandered to the snack stand." But they weren't at the snack stand. They weren't in the bathrooms. They weren't anywhere in the immediate zoo area. Within 30 minutes, the manager was called. The zoo was placed into a lockdown. Gates were closed. All exits were monitored. The staff began combing the zoo. By 1:15 p.m., the police had arrived, and the maintenance area, the one sealed with orange ribbon, was hastily and silently blocked off completely. A new sign was hung across the entrance. Temporarily closed, no access beyond this point. Something about the speed and subtlety of that change made Ms. Hamilton feel sick to her stomach. By the time the sun began to dip behind the tall pine trees surrounding the zoo, the cheerful sounds of children's laughter had been replaced with silence, punctuated only by police radios and the crunch of boots over gravel. Parents had started arriving, confused and then horrified to learn that their children's field trip had taken a nightmarish turn. News spread fast in a town like Willow Creek. Detective Carla Mendoza, a seasoned officer from the county sheriff's department, arrived on scene around 3 p.m. with her partner, Officer Grant Lively. Mendoza was no stranger to missing persons cases, but 4 children, gone during a supervised school outing, was unprecedented. She met with Ms. Hamilton and the zoo director, Thomas Reeves, in the small administrative office beside the main entrance. Thomas looked pale and shaken, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over the zoo's map and a sparse log of staff shifts. "I don't understand how they could have left without anyone seeing," he kept repeating. "We keep everything locked. The gates, the animal sheds, even the trash dumpsters." Detective Mendoza wasn't reassured. She requested surveillance footage from the security system, especially around the petting zoo and the side entrance, which employees sometimes used for deliveries. Reeves hesitated. "We've had issues with the cameras near the petting zoo," he admitted. "They're old. We're upgrading next month." Of course they were. Still, he handed over what footage they had. Mendoza's team began combing through the recordings immediately, watching the children interact with animals, listening to the distant hum of laughter and chatter. But at exactly 12:26 p.m., the camera facing the side of the petting zoo glitched. For 17 seconds, the screen went black. When the feed returned, the 4 missing children were no longer visible. "Could be nothing," Officer Lively muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Mendoza's eyes narrowed. Back in the petting zoo, cadaver dogs were brought in. They sniffed the area thoroughly, tugging at leashes near the sealed maintenance enclosure. The zoo staff insisted the section was used only for storage and had been under repair for weeks. But when Mendoza asked to look inside, Reeves stalled. "There's construction equipment in there," he said. "It's not safe." "Then we'll be careful," Mendoza replied coldly, and ordered the padlock removed. The inside of the maintenance zone was smaller than expected. A cramped tool shed, a few crates, tarps, a rusty wheelbarrow. But something didn't sit right. A floor panel inside the shed looked newer than the others, and the ground around it was uneven. When officers pulled it up, they found a small dirt tunnel, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, stretching into the earth. "What the hell is this?" Lively asked under his breath. The zoo staff swore they had no knowledge of it. The tunnel was too narrow and unstable for immediate entry, but Mendoza had her team document everything. A ground-penetrating radar scan was ordered for the following morning. That night, the zoo released a public statement. Timber Valley Zoo is temporarily closing its petting zoo section for maintenance following an unrelated structural concern. "We are cooperating fully with authorities." The wording struck everyone, especially the parents, as calculated. Meanwhile, rumors spread. Some said they saw a strange truck parked behind the zoo earlier in the week. Others whispered about how the same zoo had been quietly sued 10 years ago, after a teenage volunteer went missing during an overnight animal care event. The case had been settled. Few remembered the details. At 11:47 p.m., Mendoza received a call from forensics. The soil pulled from inside the tunnel showed signs of blood. By the following morning, The town of Willow Creek was fully consumed by fear. The local radio station aired updates every hour. Social media exploded with wild theories. Everything from secret animal trafficking rings to satanic cults in the woods. But Detective Carla Mendoza had no interest in speculation. She had a tunnel, blood traces, for missing children, and a building number of unanswered questions. The forensic team arrived with the ground-penetrating radar just after 9 a.m. The petting zoo area had been taped off completely, and the rest of the zoo remained closed under the vague guise of safety inspections. But Mendoza knew the media wouldn't buy the official line for long. Officer Grant Lively stood beside her as the radar began scanning the earth around the hidden tunnel. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" he asked. Mendoza shook her head. "No, and I've worked some bad cases." The radar revealed what they feared: a network of narrow passageways running beneath the zoo, branching out like veins. One route stretched nearly 30 feet under the woods behind the enclosures. "Someone built this," one technician muttered. "Not animals. This was deliberate." Later that day, the team excavated more of the tunnel. They found a torn piece of blue fabric near the curve of a wall, a scrap from a child's windbreaker. Near it, a broken charm bracelet. No bodies, no footprints, but definitely signs of movement. The tunnel opened into a small chamber lined with wooden panels, old, rotting, but clearly man-made. What disturbed Mendoza most was what was in the chamber. Scratches on the wall, dozens of them. Some carved numbers, a date, coordinates, and others simply tally marks. One corner had children's names faintly etched into the wood. First names only: Maya, Ben, Lola, and Ty. Mendoza didn't need to guess. She stepped back, breath caught in her throat. "They were here," she said quietly. But where had they gone? The zoo's management remained evasive. Thomas Reeves insisted again he knew nothing of the tunnels, nothing of prior incidents. But when pressed about the missing teenage volunteer from 10 years ago, his hands trembled. We thought she ran away. The police couldn't prove otherwise." "No one thought to look under the zoo?" Mendoza asked. He didn't answer. That night, the parents of the missing children gathered in front of the sheriff's office demanding answers. Emotions were raw. One mother screamed until her voice gave out. The principal of Timber Valley Elementary stepped forward to read a brief statement, but it only made things worse. "We believe law enforcement is doing everything they can to bring our children home safely. We urge the community to remain calm." But calm was no longer possible. That same evening, a local blogger posted drone footage of the zoo grounds, filmed before the area had been completely shut off. In the footage, something strange was visible: a dark outline under the surface of the woods. Long and angular, rectangular, an unmarked building or container, mostly buried. When the image was shared with police, Mendoza ordered a unit to investigate. The coordinates led them half a mile past the zoo's rear fence line into county-owned forest. There, buried beneath moss and brush, they found a rusted shipping container. Inside, empty animal cages, ropes, chains, and claw marks on the walls. But no children. Mendoza stood at the edge of the container and whispered, "This wasn't a zoo. It was something else entirely." The discovery of the buried shipping container sent a shockwave through the investigative team. It was the first hard proof that the zoo's petting area wasn't just for baby goats and friendly alpacas. This had been planned, purposeful, evil. Mendoza returned to the makeshift command post set up outside the zoo's entrance. Satellite images were being analyzed, old maps pulled from archives. She needed to know how long those tunnels had been under there and who had access. But there was another breakthrough. A retired zoo maintenance worker, Harold Dean, came forward after hearing the news. He'd worked there in the 90s and early 2000s, mostly night shifts. Now in his 70s and battling dementia, Harold's memory was hazy, but not useless. "I remember. They didn't let us near the back pastures after dark," he said, sitting in a worn recliner at his nursing home. "Said it was for safety. But I heard things. Noises. One time, saw a van pull up after closing, men unloading something. Not animals. They were too quiet." Mendoza pressed gently. "Do you remember any names? Faces?" He shook his head. "Just one thing. A badge. One of the men wore a badge that said Reeves." Mendoza's heart jumped. Thomas Reeves, the current director. But Thomas had insisted he only took over 5 years ago. Back at the station, she confronted him again. He paled. "My uncle," he said, voice dry. "Walter Reeves. He ran the place in the early 2000s. Died in a hunting accident in 2012. And you never thought that might be relevant?" Thomas swallowed hard. "I didn't know what he was doing. I swear." But Mendoza didn't believe in coincidences. Warrants were filed. Records seized. An old employee file led them to another name. Alan Mercer, former groundskeeper, terminated in 2011. His address was a small house near the county line. Overgrown lawn. Mail piling up. Inside, they found the walls covered with photos, children's faces, newspaper clippings, even blueprints of the zoo. He was gone, but his obsession remained. One photo stood out, a blurry shot of the petting zoo from 2010. In the corner, nearly out of frame, stood a woman in a khaki vest, watching. Zooming in, Mendoza's blood chilled. It was Barbara Tilling, the current volunteer coordinator. They brought her in. First, Barbara denied everything. She claimed the photo wasn't her, that she only started working at the zoo last year. But her alibi didn't check out, and more importantly, her fingerprints were found on one of the scratched walls in the tunnel chamber. Faced with evidence, her facade cracked. "I didn't hurt them," she said, voice trembling. I helped move them. That's all I did." "Move them where?" Mendoza demanded. Barbara looked away. "It wasn't supposed to happen again. They promised me it wouldn't. But then those kids. They were just supposed to scare the school, make a statement. No one was meant to get hurt." "What kind of statement?" Barbara's voice dropped to a whisper. "They think the land belongs to them. Not the county. Not the zoo. The group that built the tunnels, they called themselves the Guardians." It sounded like a cult. Or worse. Mendoza was sick of cryptic words. "Where are the children?" Barbara broke. "There's a structure. An old lodge in the woods. They used to meet there. If they took the kids anywhere, it's there." Coordinates in hand, the team moved fast. As dawn broke, a convoy of vehicles pushed deeper into the forest than any previous search. They found the lodge, a decaying 2-story structure, hidden under layers of moss and trees. The smell of rot clung to the air. Inside were more cages, rusted, cold, food wrappers, a child's sock, but still no children. Then Officer Lively shouted from outside. "Footprints. Small ones, and they're fresh." The trail led down a slope to a dry riverbed, then into a narrow crevice between 2 rock faces. It ended at a wooden door set into the rock itself, nearly invisible unless you were standing right in front of it. It was padlocked. Mendoza raised her flashlight and whispered, "Get the bolt cutters." The metal bolt snapped with a clean, echoing clink, and the wooden door creaked inward. The air inside was stale and damp, carrying a sour, earthy scent. Flashlights swept across stone walls, revealing a narrow passage carved into the rock. Not natural, but old. Too old. The team moved carefully, Mendoza in the lead, her heart pounding with each step. The hallway twisted and descended until it opened into a wider chamber. And then, silence broke, a rustling sound, like fabric shifting or feet scuffling. "Police!" Mendoza called out. "If anyone's in here, you're safe now." A pause. Then a voice. Weak, small. "Hello." Mendoza ran. In the far corner of the chamber, behind a curtain made of hanging canvas tarps, they found them, 9 children, huddled together, blinking in the sudden light, pale and thin but alive. The room erupted into motion. Officers calling for paramedics, radios chirping, kids crying. Some clung to Mendoza, too stunned to speak. They'd been kept underground for over a week. The missing time between the school hike and the petting zoo was still a blur for many of them. They remembered a strange van, a long ride, being led through a tunnel by people in masks. A place with animals, but not the zoo. Something else. A place they weren't allowed to talk in. And most disturbing of all, they weren't alone. Other kids had been there. Some older, some younger. None of them spoke. Some didn't even seem to understand where they were. By the time the rescue made headlines, the nation was gripped with shock and horror. A group calling themselves the Guardians of the Living Earth, an offshoot of an eco-radical movement from the 1990s, had been using parts of the zoo's land and tunnel network to conduct ritual rewildings of children. Their goal was to disconnect the next generation from artificial society. Barbara Tilling had been a recruiter, so had Alan Mercer. Walter Reeves, the late former zoo director, had bankrolled the operation under a charity facade. The tunnels were older than the zoo itself, built originally as Cold War shelters, then forgotten. Authorities dismantled the lodge, shut down the zoo, and began identifying the other children recovered in the raid. Some had been missing for years, their families never given answers. Some didn't even remember their names. But Mendoza couldn't shake the unease. She sat one night in her car, rereading one girl's statement. "They told us not to go near the far room. The dark one," the girl had whispered. "They said the first ones were still in there, watching." A follow-up search of the tunnels found no such room. But that part of the system had already collapsed. Still, Mendoza asked them to seal it with concrete. No press, no photos, just buried. The case closed with more questions than answers. But the children, at least some of them, were home. And the next time Mendoza visited the petting zoo grounds, long since overgrown with weeds, she saw something etched into a tree stump near the old barn. "The earth keeps what it needs." She stared at it for a long time, and then she turned away.